So, Frank, you were drawing my attention to an article in the Wall Street Journal from, I think, a couple of days ago.
Yes.
Would you like to say something about that?
Sure. Thank you. It was June 21st, and I believe it was a front-page article. It was something about economic difficulties in China are causing increases in prices to U.S. And really what it went on to say is that the Chinese workforce, I wouldn't say has caught up yet to the Western or American workforce in terms of salaries and benefits, but has exponentially leaped many, many times in cost from even 5 years ago. So a number of American outsource operations and manufacturing operations in China have obviously seen resulting dramatic increases in their own costs, which are cutting down on their margins, and even in some instances, apparently are making some Chinese-produced goods competitive or perhaps even less expensive than American-produced goods. So it's sort of like a two-sided coin, as most coins are. Well, it's sort of good news for the American economy in that the Chinese are facing some of the same factors that cause American wages to be high, and thus are correspondingly seeing an increase in the price of their own goods. The surge in offshore setups in China for manufacturing plants and the like seems to have slowed. Some companies apparently are even shifting to Mexico from China.
Yeah.
So, and then the article pointed out some other factors in China. It alluded to other articles that the Wall Street Journal has been carrying about a surge in possible Chinese bank exposure to so-called underwater mortgages, and how, admittedly, with the fast pace of the Chinese economy's growth in the past 50 years and the past 10 years specifically, they're not totally impermeable to many of the same afflictions that have hit the Western economy. So it's sort
of related to India in any way?
They did not mention India in this article, but they have mentioned India in prior articles, mainly in the following context, namely that the Chinese one-child-per-family rule, which is mostly followed, except in the provinces it seems, is going to end up producing a little demographic dip 20 to 25 years from now, which will be seen in a completely opposite manner with a demographic bump in India 20 to 25 years from now. And that, combined with the increase in Indian GDP anyway, which has matched that of China, combined again with the belief in the West that the Indian political system and democratic system is more stable inherently long-term than what may happen in China when and if regime change occurs, is beginning to make India look perhaps more attractive.
I find it very interesting to compare China and India, especially in terms of data like these, in the context of globalization, because we in the Western world, and I think perhaps particularly in America, have a very positive view of India and a relatively negative view of China. And I think much of what we think about India is partial and biased in one direction, and much of what we think about China is biased in the other direction. I mean, China had the one-child policy. Indira Gandhi went out of her way to sterilize a lot of people without asking them if they really wanted to be sterilized. Both countries have big problems of abortions of unwanted female fetuses. But India generally gets a good press, and if there's anything bad to say about it, it goes in the back pages, and if there's something bad to say about China, it goes in the front pages. And I think what we're watching is the last stages of the great convergence of world economies, and that it's actually happening faster in China than in India. Partly because of the difference in the system of government, because due to the fact that India has a democratic structure, the Westminster structure, which is the only country in the world where the Westminster structure has survived outside Westminster, I think.
You might be right.
We think of it as being just the right way to do things, but in fact it doesn't work very well, and there is as much civil disturbance in India as there is in China. And even though there has been an accelerating process of urbanization in India, it's nothing compared to what's happened in China. So that the Indian society today is much less homogeneous than Chinese society is. And of course there are problems in both. But it means that the rate of change in China is significantly greater than in India, and that the Chinese government, however authoritarian and to our view repressive it may be, can't control what's going on, and is desperately trying to manage what's going on in such a way that there will be the minimum amount of disturbance, but there are disturbances all the time, and the government is only able to manage a certain number of them to a certain extent. And that may interrupt me when you.
I was just going to maybe ask a little sideline that you could comment on, and that is a perception on your part of how great has the rate of change been in China. I can remember, I'm 56 years old, and I can remember growing up seeing that photograph from World War II, the Japanese rape of Nanking. The little girl in the railroad yard crying, and I can remember mite box collections in Catholic schools with monies to be collected supposedly to be given to Chinese children, Chinese babies, and there had always been a pastoral kind of view of China, agrarian-based, etc. And your point's well taken, because now clearly when I think of China, I think of these urban megalopolises. We had a group in here in the beginning of the spring from Chengdu. I had never heard of Chengdu. I went to the internet and learned it was a city of 11 million people. All right, I look at the front page of the business section of today's New York Times, talking about the increase in Chinese railroads, the super high-speed rail trains, and then talking about how now, in fact, the West is viewing these trains as being a real competitive edge for the Chinese, because all of a sudden now it's no longer just going to be the main seaports on the east coast of China that are going to be accessible for goods and services, that they're all going to, 4 or 5 hours inland are cities like Chengdu.
And they're extending the railway to Tehran.
It's like Kaiser Wilhelm's view in reverse. Yes, they are.
No, I think it's Foreign Policy magazine that has this data in the most accessible form. The number of new cities and the acceleration and the pace of growth of new cities in China over the last 20 years. And I don't remember offhand, I don't have the figures in my head of how many cities there are in China of over 1 million population. But it's a significant number. And this has all happened in the last 20, or most of it has happened in the last 20 years.
It's very, very difficult. It's for me, and I'm sitting here in the United States. My only exposure to China comes at the Chinese restaurant a couple times a month. But for me to grasp what's happening in China, I can't imagine what it would be like for an offspring of a Deng Xiaoping, for example, who might be in a higher position in the Chinese government, or somebody in that age cohort, brought up in the same way, listening to stories about the camaraderie in the caves at Yan'an, how they all fought together in the Long March, etc., etc., to be able to put their hands or head around what's like a tidal wave of change coming at them. I mean, how do they even process this, and how do they begin to respond to it? What are they afraid of? What are they not afraid of?
The most significant aspect of this change, I think, is that China has had its current identity for over 2,000 years, roughly 2,000 200 years.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a very large area that had a single identity, with a population of which only the upper echelons were in any way integrated over the extent of that territory. But most people lived in small isolated communities. And most of China remained pretty much in that condition until less than a century ago. Mm-hmm. And it's only really since the Cultural Revolution in the 60s, and to an increasing extent since Deng Xiaoping, that the country as a whole, which is now 3 times the size it was a little over half a century ago, has become a single society, so that the ordinary Chinese, educated or uneducated, is fully aware of being a part of a society of 1.3 billion people. And that's what makes the change. And that hasn't happened in India. India has not had a sense of being one society until the British created it. Mm-hmm. And Gandhi prevented the national integration. Gandhi's philosophy of how to run the country on independence prevented the integration on a national level. Mm-hmm. During his lifetime, which of course wasn't very long after independence, but his views were the commanding views in the government until almost the same time that Deng Xiaoping opened things up in China. But still, because India has this Westminster structure, and the central government has less authority throughout the country, and connected to that, of course, is the way ordinary people in isolated villages think in terms of what we call a caste structure. The national integration hasn't proceeded at anything like the same rate, and there's a large part of the population who don't yet feel part of a national society in India.
So and I think you've just turned I think you turned my conclusion on its head, because I think what you mean is that much of this integration of the society in China is in fact due to the central government. Due to the efforts of people like Deng Xiaoping, because certainly India, for example, has as much internet access and access to freedom of the press and free speech as does China, if not more. Certainly India has the right of free travel without internal passports. Certainly India, on a list of physical attributes to be able to encourage more mobility, more contact with other people in India, certainly can beat China or match it hands down everywhere. But that absence of a prodding effect is not there at a national level, I think you're saying.
To risk changing the subject at this one, we've only got a minute or so left. I would say that if China was in America's position and wanted to end the war in Afghanistan, the government could make up its mind whether to end the war in Afghanistan, whereas America can't make up its mind whether to end the war in Afghanistan, mm-hmm. Because at the head of the way the political decisions are made is a logjam. Mm-hmm. Now, there may be some degree of logjam in China as well, in
much smaller scale.
But but not quite the same.
So
I think the way we think about violence, and therefore the way we evaluate what's going on and systems of government and so on in different countries, has been changing and is continuing to change. So that it's very difficult for us to think about anything that has to do with violent conflict without thinking of it in the terms that were generally accepted 50 years ago, at least at the time of the Korean and Vietnam Wars, if not at the time of the Second World War. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And yet the way people decide on issues that have to do with participation or promotion of violent conflict today is in fact very different. And so these are things that set us and the Chinese apart when it comes to them evaluating us or us evaluating them. And we need to have much more direct interaction between us on a much broader level than happens at the moment. In order to be able to understand at a different level, philosophical level, the differences and the implications of the differences between the way we evaluate events in the modern world.
So, and I'll go back to you for the last word, but the difficulties that we have evaluating them are perhaps shared by them, and them having difficulties in evaluating us.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
Absolutely.
I never really realized that.
Okay, see you next week.
Thanks very much, Professor.